Section 11 of Sam Lawson's Old Town Fireside Stories by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Section 11. Laughin' in Meetin'. We were in disgrace, we boys, and the reason of it was this. We had laughed out in meetin' time. To be sure, the occasion was a trying one, even to more disciplined nerves. Parson Lothrop had exchanged pulpits with the Parson Summerall of North Weir. Now, Parson Summerall was a man in the very outset likely to provoke the risibles of unspiritualized juveniles. He was a thin, wiry, frisky little man in a powdered white wig, black tights and silk stockings, with bright knee buckles and shoe buckles, with round, dark, snapping eyes, and a curious, high, cracked, squeaking voice, the very first tones of which made all the children stare and giggle. The news that Parson Summerall was going to preach in our village spread abroad among us as a prelude to something funny. It had a flavor like the charm of circus acting, and on the Sunday morning of our story we went to the house of God in a very hilarious state, all ready to set off in a laugh on the slightest provocation. The occasion was not long wanting. Parson Lothrop had a favorite dog, yclept Trip, whose behavior in meeting was notoriously far from that edifying pattern which benefits a minister's dog on Sundays. Trip was a nervous dog, and a dog that never could be taught to conceal his emotions or to respect conventionalities. If anything about the performance in the singer's seat did not please him, he was apt to express himself in a lugubrious howl. If the sermon was longer than suited him, he would gape with such a loud creak of his jaws as would arouse everybody's attention. If the flies disturbed his afternoon's nap, he would give sudden snarls or snaps, or if anything troubled his dreams, he would bark out in his sleep in a manner not only to dispel his own slumbers, but those of certain worthy deacons and old ladies, whose sanctuary repose was thereby sorely broken and troubled. For all these reasons, Madame Lothrop had been forced, as a general thing, to deny Trip the usual sanctuary privileges of good family dogs in that age, and shut him up on Sundays to private meditation. Trip, of course, was only the more set on attendance, and would hide behind doors, jump out of windows, sneak through byways and alleys, and lie hid till the second bell had done tolling, when suddenly he would appear in the broad aisle, innocent and happy, and take his seat as composedly as any member of the congregation. Imagine us youngsters on the Q.V. with excitement at seeing Parson Summerall frisk up into the pulpit with all the vivacity of a black grasshopper. We looked at each other and giggled very cautiously, with due respect to Aunt Lois's sharp observation. At first there was only a mild, quiet simmering of giggle, compressed decorously within the bounds of propriety, and we pursed our muscles up with stringent resolution whenever we caught the apprehensive eye of our elders. But when, directly after the closing notes of the tolling second bell, Master Trip walked gravely up the front aisle, and seating himself squarely in front of the pulpit, raised his nose with a critical air toward the scene of the forthcoming performance, it was too much for us. The repression was almost convulsive. Trip wore an alert, attentive air, befitting a sound, orthodox dog, who smells a possible heresy, and deems it his duty to watch the performances narrowly. Evidently he felt called upon to see who and what were to occupy that pulpit in his master's absence. Up rose Parson Summerall, and up went Trip's nose, vibrating with intense attention. The parson began in his high, cracked voice to intone the hymn, "Sing to the Lord aloud," when Trip broke into a dismal howl. The parson went on to give directions to the deacon in the same voice in which he had been reading, so that the whole effect of the performance was somewhat as follows: "Sing to the Lord aloud," please to turn out that dog, "and make a joyful noise." The dog was turned out, and the choir did their best to make a joyful noise, but we boys were upset for the day, delivering over to the temptations of Satan, and plunged in waves and billows of hysterical giggle, from which neither winks nor frowns from Aunt Lois, nor the awful fear of the tithing man, nor the comforting bits of fennel and orange peel passed us by grandmother could recover us. Everybody felt, to be sure, that here was a trial that called for some indulgence. Hard faces, even among the stoniest saints, betrayed a transient quiver of the risible muscles. Old ladies put up their fans, youths and maidens in the singer seat laughed outright, and for the moment a general snicker among the children was pardoned. But I was one of that luckless kind whose nerves, once set in vibration, could not be composed. When the reign of gravity and decorum had returned, Harry and I sat by each other, shaking with suppressed laughter. Everything in the subsequent exercises took a funny turn, and in the long prayer, when everybody else was still and decorous, the whole scene came over me with such overpowering force that I exploded with laughter, and had to be taken out of meeting and marched home by Aunt Lois as a convicted criminal. What especially moved her indignation was that the more she rebuked and upbraided, the more I laughed, till the tears rolled down my cheeks, which Aunt Lois construed into willful disrespect to her authority, and resented accordingly. By Sunday evening, as we gathered around the fire, the reaction from undue gaiety to sobriety had taken place, and we were in a pensive and penitent state. Grandmother was gracious and forgiving, but Aunt Lois still preserved that frosty air of reprobation which she held to be a salutary means of quickening our consciences for the future. It was, therefore, with unusual delight that we saw our old friend Sam come in and sit himself quietly down on the block in the chimney corner. With Sam we felt assured of indulgence and patronage, for though always rigidly moral and instructive in his turn of mind, he had that fellow feeling for transgressors which is characteristic of the loose-jointed, easy-going style of his individuality. "Lordy massy, boys, yes," said Sam virtuously, in view of some of Aunt Lois's thrusts. "You ought never to laugh nor cut up in meetin', that thar's so. But then there is times when the best on us gets took down. We gets took unawares, you see. Even ministers does. Yes, nature will get the upper hand afore they know it." "Why, Sam, ministers don't ever laugh in meetin', do they?" We put the question with wide eyes. Such a supposition bordered on profanity, we thought. It was approaching the sin of Uzziah, who unwarily touched the ark of the Lord. "Laws, yes. Why, haven't you never heard how there was a council held to try Parson Morell for laughing out in prayer meeting?" "Laughing in prayer time," we both repeated, with uplifted hands and eyes. My grandfather's mild face became luminous with a suppressed smile, which brightened as the moon does a cloud, but he said nothing. "Yes, yes," said my grandmother, "that affair did make a dreadful scandal in the time on it. But Parson Morell was a good man, and I'm glad the council wasn't hard on him." "Well," said Sam Lawson, "after all, it was more Ike Babbitt's fault than 'twas anybody's. You see, Ike, he was allers for getting what he could out of the town, and he would feed his sheep on the meetin' house green. Somehow or other, Ike's fences allers contrived to give out come Sunday, and up would come his sheep. And Ike was too pious to drive 'em back Sunday, and so there they was. He was talked to enough about it, 'cause, you see, to have sheep and lambs a-bayin' and a-blattin' all prayers and sermon time wa'n't the thing. Remember that there old meetin' house up to the north end, down under Blueberry Hill? The land sort of sloped down, so as a body had to come into the meetin' house steppin' down instead of up. Fact was, they said 'twas put there 'cause the land wasn't good for nothing else, and the folks thought putting a meetin' house on it would be a clear saving. But Parson Morell, he didn't like it, and was free to tell 'em his mind on it. That 'twas like bringing the lame and the blind to the Lord's service, but there 'twas. There wasn't a better minister, nor no one more set by in all the state, than Parson Morell. His doctrines was right up and down, good and sharp, and he give saints and sinners their meat in due season, and for consoling and comforting widders and orphans, Parson Morell hadn't his match. The women sot lots by him, and he was allers ready to take tea round, and make things pleasant and comfortable, and he had a good story for every one, and a word for the children, and maybe an apple or a cookie in his pocket for 'em. Well, there ain't no pleasing everybody, and if Gabriel himself, right down out of heaven, was to come and be a minister, I expect there'd be a picking at his wings and a sort of fault finding. Now, Aunt Jerushy Scran and Aunt Polly Hoken, they said Parson Morell wasn't solemn enough. You see, there's them that thinks that a minister ought to be just like the town hearse, so that you think of death, judgment, and eternity, and nothing else when you see him round, and if they see a man rosy and chipper, and having a pretty nice sociable sort of time, why, they say he ain't spiritual minded. But in my times, I've seen ministers the most awakening kind in the pulpit, that was the liveliest when they was out on it. There is a time to laugh, Scripture says, though some folks never seem to remember that there. But, Sam, how came you to say it was Ike Babbitt's fault? What was it about the sheep? Oh, well, yes, I'm a-comin' to that there. It was all about them sheep. I expect they was the instrument the devil sot to work to tempt Parson Morell to laugh in prayer time. You see, there was old Dick, Ike's bellwether, was the fightin'est old critter that ever you see. Why, Dick would butt at his own shadder, and everybody said it was a shame the old critter should be left to run loose, 'cause he run at the children and scared the women half out their wits. Well, I used to live out in that parish in them days, and Lem Suddock and I used to go out sparkin' Sunday nights to see the larkin' gals, and we had to go right across the lot where Dick was, so we used to go and stand at the fence and call. And Dick would see us, and put down his head, and run at us full chisel, and come bunt agin the fence, and then I'd ketch him by the horns and hold him while Lem run and got over the fence to t'other side of the lot, and then I'd let go. And Len would holler and shake a stick at him, and away he'd go full butt at Lem. And Lem would ketch his horns and hold him till I came over. That was the way we managed Dick. But I tell you, if he come sudden up behind a feller, he'd give him a butt in the small of his back that would make him run on all fours one while. He was a great rogue, Dick was. Well, that summer, I remember they had old Deacon Titkins for tithing man, and I tell you he give it to the boys lively. There wasn't no sleeping nor no playing, for the deacon had eyes like a gimlet, and he was quick as a cat, and the youngsters had to look out for themselves. It did really seem as if the deacon was like them 4 beasts in the Revelations that was full of eyes behind and before. For whichever way he was standing, if you gave only a wink, he was down on you and hit you a tap with his stick. I know once Lem Suddock just wrote 2 words in his psalm book and passed to Keziah Larkin, and the deacon give him such a tap that Lem grew red as a beet and vowed he'd be up with him some day for that. Well, Lordy massy, folks that is so chipper and high-steppin' has to have their come-downs, and the deacon he had to have his. That there Sunday, I remember it now just as well as if 'twas yesterday, the parson he give us his gret sermon, reconcilin' decrees and free agency. Everybody said that there sermon was a masterpiece. He preached it up to Cambridge at commencement that year. Well, it so happened that it was one of them bilin' hot days that come in August, when you can fairly hear the huckleberries a-sizzlin' and cookin' on the bushes, and the locust keeps a-gratin' like a red-hot saw. Well, such times, decrees or no decrees, the best on us would get sleepy. The old meetin' house stood right down at the foot of a hill that kep' off all the wind, and the sun blazed away at them great west winders, and there was pretty sleepy times there. Well, the deacon he flew round a spell, and woke up the children, and tapped the boys on the head, and kep' everything straight as he could, till the sermon was most through, when he really got most tuckered out, and he took a chair, and he sot down in the door right opposite the minister, and fairly got asleep himself, just as the minister got up to make the last prayer. Well, Parson Morell had a way of praying with his eyes open. Folks said it wasn't the best way, but it was Parson Morell's way, anyhow, and so as he was praying he couldn't help seeing that Deacon Titkins was a-nodding and a-bobbing out toward the place where old Dick was feeding with the sheep, front of the meeting-house door. Lem and me, we was sitting where we could look out, and we just sees old Dick stop feeding and look at the deacon. The deacon had a little round head as smooth as an apple, with a nice powdered wig on it, and he sot there making bobs and bows, and Dick begun to think it was something sort of personal. Lem and me was just sitting where we could see the whole picture, and Lem was fit to split. "Good now," says he, "that critter'll pay the deacon off lively pretty soon." The deacon bobbed his head a spell, and old Dick, he shook his horns and stamped at him sort of threatening. Finally the deacon, he give a great bow and brought his head right down at him, and old Dick, he sawed out full tilt and come down on him, ker-chunk, and knocked him head over heels into the broad aisle, and his wig flew one way and he t'other, and Dick made a lunge at it as it flew, and carried it off on his horns. Well, you may believe that broke up the meeting for one while, for Parson Morell laughed out, and all the gals and boys, they stomped and roared, and the old deacon, he got up and began rubbing his shins, 'cause he didn't see the joke on it. "You don't orter laugh," says he. "It's no laughing matter. It's a solemn thing," says he. "I might have been sent into eternity by that darn critter," says he. Then they all roared and haw-hawed the more to see the deacon dancing around with his little shiny head, so smooth a fly would trip up on it. "I believe my soul you'd laugh to see me in my grave," says he. Well, the truth on it was, 'twas just one of them busted up times that nature has, when there ain't nothing for it but to give in. 'Twas just like the ice breaking up in the Charles River. It all come at once, and no woe to it. Sunday or no Sunday, sin or no sin, the most on 'em laughed till they cried, and couldn't help it. But the deacon, he went home feeling pretty sore about it. Lem Sudduck, he picked up his wig and handed it to him. Says he, "Old Dick was playing tithing man, wasn't he, deacon? Teach you to make allowance for other folks that get sleepy." Then Miss Titkins, she went over to Aunt Jerushy Scran's and Aunt Polly Hokum's, and they had a pot of tea over it, and agreed it was awful of Parson Morell to set such an example, and something had to be done about it. Miss Hokum said she allers knew that Parson Morell hadn't no spirituality, and now it had broke out into open sin, and let all the rest on him into it. And Miss Titkins, she said such a man wasn't fit to preach, and Miss Hokum said she couldn't never hear him again, and the next Sunday the deacon and his wife, they hitched up and driv 8 miles over to Parson Lothrop's and took Aunt Polly on the back seat. Well, the thing growed and growed till it seemed as if there weren't nothing else talked about, 'cause Aunt Polly and Miss Titkins and Jerushy Scran, they didn't do nothing but talk about it, and that sot everybody else a-talking. Finally it was agreed they must have a council to settle the hash. So all the women, they went to chopping mince and making up pumpkin pies and cranberry tarts and barlin doughnuts, getting ready for the ministers and delegates, 'cause councils always eats powerful, and they had quite a stir, like a general training. The hosses, they was hitched all up and down the stalls, a-stomping and a-switching their tails, and all the women was a-talking, and they had up everybody round for witnesses. And finally Parson Morell, he says, "Brethren," says he, "just let me tell you the story just as it happened, and if you don't every one of you laugh as hard as I did, why, then I'll give up." The parson, he was a master hand at setting off a story, and afore he'd done he'd got 'em all in such a roar they didn't know where to leave off. Finally they give sentence that there hadn't no temptation took him but such as is common to man, but they advised him afterwards allers to pray with his eyes shut. And the parson, he confessed he orter a done it, and meant to do better in future, and so they settled it. "So, boys," said Sam, who always drew a moral, "you see, it learns you. You must take care what you look at if you want to keep from laughing in meeting." End of section 11. Laughing in meeting. Section 12 of Sam Lawson's Old Town Fireside Stories by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Section 12. Tom Toothaker's Ghost Story. "What is it about that old house in Sherborne?" said Aunt Nabby to Sam Lawson, as he sat drooping over the coals of a fire one October evening. Aunt Lois was gone to Boston on a visit, and the smart spice of her skepticism being absent, we felt the more freedom to start our storytelling on one of his legends. Aunt Nabby sat trotting her knitting needles on a blue mix yarn stocking. Grandmamma was knitting in unison at the other side of the fire. Grandfather sat studying the Boston Courier. The wind outside was sighing in fitful wails, creaking the pantry doors, occasionally puffing in a vicious gust down the broad throat of the chimney. It was a drizzly, sleety evening, and the wet lilac bushes now and then rattled and splashed against the window as the wind moaned and whispered through them. We boys had made preparation for a comfortable evening. We had enticed Sam to the chimney corner and drawn him a mug of cider. We had set down a row of apples to roast on the hearth, which even now were giving faint sighs and sputters as their plump sides burst in the genial heat. The big oak backlog simmered and bubbled and distilled large drops down amid the ashes, and the great hickory forestick had just burned out into solid bright coals, faintly skimmed over with white ashes. The whole area of the big chimney was full of a sleepy warmth and brightness just calculated to call forth fancies and visions. It only wanted somebody now to set Sam off, and Aunt Nabby broached the ever-interesting subject of haunted houses. "Well, now, Miss Badger," said Sam, "I been over there and walked round that there house considerable, and I talked with Granny Hokum and Aunt Polly, and they've pretty much come to the conclusion that they'll have to move out on it. You see, these yer noises, they keep 'em awake nights, and Aunt Polly, she gets stericky, and Hannah Jane, she says if they stay in the house, she can't live with 'em no longer, and what can them lone women do without Hannah Jane? Why, Hannah Jane, she says these 2 months past she's seen a woman reg'lar walking up and down the front hall between 12 and 1 o'clock at night, and it's just the image and body of old Ma'am Tillotson, Parks and Hokum's mother, that everybody knowed was a thunderin' kind of woman that kept everything in a muss while she was alive. What the old critter's up to now there ain't no knowin'. Some folks seems to think it's a sign Granny Hokum's time's comin'. But, Lordy massy, says she to me, says she, 'Why, Sam, I don't know nothing what I've done that Madam Tillotson should be set loose on me.' Anyway, they've all got so nervy that Jed Hokum has been up from Needham and is going to cart 'em all over to live with him. Jed, he's for hushin' on it up, 'cause he says it brings a bad name on the property. Well, I talked with Jed about it, and says I to Jed, says I, 'Now, if you'll take my advice, just you give that there old house a regular overhaulin', and paint it over with 2 coats of paint, and that there'll clear 'em out if anything will. Ghosts is like bedbugs, they can't stand fresh paint,' says I. They allers clear out. I've seen it tried on a ship that got haunted." "Why, Sam, do ships get haunted?" "To be sure they do. Haunted the worst kind. Why, I could tell you a story'd make your hair rise on end. Only I'm afraid of frightening boys when they're just going to bed." "Oh, you can't frighten Horace," said my grandmother. "He will go and sit out there in the graveyard till 9 o'clock nights, spite of all I tell him." "Do tell, Sam," we urged. "What was it about the ship?" Sam lifted his mug of cider, deliberately turned it round and round in his hands, eyed it affectionately, took a long drink, and set it down in front of him on the hearth, and began. You 'member I telled you how I went to sea down east when I was a boy, 'long with Tom Toothaker? Well, Tom, he reeled off a yarn one night that was about the toughest I ever had the pullin' on, and it come all straight, too, from Tom. 'Twan't none of your hearsay, 'twas what he seen with his own eyes. Now there wasn't no nonsense about Tom, not a bit on it, and he wasn't afeared on the devil himself, so he generally saw through things about as straight as things could be seen through. This year happened when Tom was mate o' the Albatross, and they was a running up to the banks for a fare o' fish. The Albatross was as handsome a craft as ever ye see, and Captain Sim Witherspoon, he was skipper, a real nice, likely man he was. I heard Tom tell this year one night to the boys on the Brilliant, when they was all a-settin' round the stove in the cabin one foggy night, that we was to anchor in Frenchman's Bay, and all kind o' layin' off loose. Tom, he said they was havin' a famous run-up to the banks. There was a spankin' southerly that blew 'em along like all nature, and they was havin' the best kind of a time, when this year southerly brought a pesky fog down on 'em, and it grew thicker than hasty puddin'. You see, that there's the pester of these year southerlies, they's the biggest fog breeders there is goin'. And so, pretty soon, you couldn't see half the ship's length afore you. Well, they all was down to supper, except Dan Sawyer at the wheel, when there come such a crash as if heaven and earth was a-splittin', and then a scrapin' and bumpin' under the ship, and gin 'em such a hiss that the pot of beans went rollin', and brought up jam agin the bulkhead, and the fellers was keeled over, men and pork and beans, kinder promiscuous. "The devil!" said Tom Toothaker. "We've run down somebody. Look out up there!" Dan, he shoved the helm hard down, and put her up to the wind, and sung out, "Lordy massy, we've struck her right amidships." "Struck what?" they all yelled, and tumbled up on deck. "Why, a little schooner," says Dan. "Didn't see her till we was right on her. She's gone down tack and sheet. Look, there's part of the wreck a-floatin' off, don't you see?" Well, they didn't see, 'cause it was so thick you couldn't hardly see your hand afore your face. But they put about, and sent out a boat, and kind of searched around. But, lordy massy, you might as well look for a drop of water in the Atlantic Ocean. Whoever they was, it was all done gone and over with 'em for this life, poor critters. Tom says they felt confoundedly about it, but what could they do? Lordy massy, what can any on us do? There's places where folks just lets go 'cause they has to. Things ain't as they want 'em, and they can't alter 'em. Sailors ain't so rough as they look. They's feelin' critters, come to put things right to 'em. And there wasn't one on 'em who wouldn't have worked all night for a chance of saving some of them poor fellows. But there 'twas. 'Twan't no use trying. Well, so they sailed on, and by the wind kind of chopped round northeast, and they come round east, and sot in for one of them regular east blows and drizzles that takes the starch out of fellers more'n a regular storm. So they concluded they might as well put into a little bay there, and come to anchor. So they sot an anchor watch, and all turned in. Well, now comes the particular curious part of Tom's story, and it was more curious 'cause Tom was the one that wouldn't have believed no other man that had told it. Tom was one of your sort of philosophers. He was for looking into things, and he wasn't in no hurry about believing, so that this'n was more remarkable on account of its being Tom that seen it than if it had been others. Tom says that night he had a pesky toothache that sort of kept grumbling and jumping, so he couldn't go to sleep, and he lay in his bunk, a-turning this way and that, till long past 12 o'clock. Tom had a thwart-ship bunk where he could see into every bunk on board except Bob Coffin's, and Bob was on the anchor watch. Well, he lay there trying to go to sleep, hearing the men snoring like bullfrogs in a swamp, and watching the lantern a-swinging back and forward, and the southwesters and pea-jackets were kind of throwing their long shadders up and down as the vessel sort of rolled and pitched, for there was a heavy swell on. And then he'd hear Bob Coffin tramp, tramp, tramping overhead, for Bob had a pretty heavy foot of his own, and all sort of mixed up together with Tom's toothache, so he couldn't get to sleep. Finally Tom he bit off a great chaw of baccy and got it well sot in his cheek, and kind of turned over to lie on it and ease the pain. Well, he says he laid a spell and dropped off in a sort of doze, when he woke in such a chill his teeth chattered and the pain come on like a knife, and he bounced over, thinking the fire had gone out in the stove. Well, sure enough, he see a man a-crouching over the stove, with his back to him, a-stretching out his hands to warm 'em. He had on a southwester and a pea-jacket, with a red tippet around his neck, and his clothes was dripping as if he'd just come in from a rain. "What the devil?" says Tom, and he riz right up and rubbed his eyes. "Bill Bridges," says he, "what shine be you up to now?" For Bill was a master uneasy critter, and allers a-getting up and walking nights, and Tom he thought it was Bill. But in a minute he looked over, and there, sure enough, was Bill, fast asleep in his bunk, mouth wide open, snoring like a Jericho ram's horn. Tom looked round and counted every man in his bunk, and then he says, "Who the devil is this? For there's Bob Coffin on deck, and the rest is all here." Well, Tom weren't a man to be put under too easy. He had his thoughts about him allers, and the first he thought in every pinch was what to do. So he sot considering a minute, sort of winking his eyes to be sure he saw straight, when sure enough there come another man backing down the companionway. "Well, there's Bob Coffin anyhow," says Tom to himself. But no, the other man he turned. Tom see his face, and sure as you live it was the face of a dead corpse. Its eyes was sot, and it just came as still across the cabin and sot down by the stove and kind of shivered and put out its hands as if it was getting warm. Tom said that there was a cold air around in the cabin, as if an iceberg was coming near, and he felt cold chills running down his back. But he jumped out of his bunk and took a step forward. "Speak," says he. "Who be you, and what do you want?" They never spoke nor looked up, but kept kind of shivering and crouching over the stove. "Well," says Tom, "I'll see who you be, anyhow." And he walked right up to the last man that come in and reached out to catch hold of his coat collar, but his hand just went through him like moonshine, and in a minute he all faded away, and when he turned round the other one was gone too. Tom stood there looking this way and that, but there weren't nothing but the old stove and the lantern swinging and the men all snoring round in their bunks. Tom he sung out to Bob Coffin. "Hello, up there," says he. But Bob never answered, and Tom went up and found Bob on his knees, his teeth a-chattering like a bag of nails, trying to say his prayers, and all he could think of was, "Now I lay me," and he kept going that over and over. You see, boys, Bob was a dreadful, wicked, swearing critter, and hadn't said no prayers since he was 2 years old, and it didn't come natural to him. "Hold your yap," said he. "What you howling about? What's up?" "Oh, Lordy massy," says Bob, "we're sent for, all on us. There's been 2 on 'em. Both on 'em went right by me." Well, Tom had his own thoughts, but he was bound to get to the bottom of things anyway. If 'twas the devil, well and good. He wanted to know it. Tom just wanted to have the matter settled one way or t'other, so he got Bob sort of stroked down and made him tell what he saw. Bob he stood to it that he was a-standing right forward, a-leaning on the windlass and kind of humming a tune, when he looked down and see a sort of queer light in the fog, and he went and took a look over the bows, when up came a man's head in a sort of southwester, and then a pair of hands and catched at the bobstay, and then the whole figure of the man riz right out of the water and clim up on the martingale till he could reach the jibstay with his hands, and then he swung himself right up onto the bowsprit and stepped aboard, and went past Bob right aft and down into the cabin. And he hadn't more'n got down afore he turned round, and there was another coming in over the bowsprit, and he went by him and down below. So there was 2 on 'em, just as Tom had seen in the cabin. Tom he studied on it a spell, and finally says he, "Bob, let you and me keep this year to ourselves and see if it'll come again. If it don't, well and good. If it does, why, we'll see about it." But Tom he told Captain Witherspoon, and the captain he agreed to keep an eye out the next night, but there weren't nothing said to the rest of the men. Well, the next night they put Bill Bridges on the watch. The fog had lifted, and they had a fair wind and was going on steady. The men all turned in and went fast asleep, except Captain Witherspoon, Tom, and Bob Coffin. Well, sure enough, twixt 12 and 1 o'clock, the same thing came over, only there was 4 men instead of 2. They come in just so over the bowsprit, and they looked neither to right nor left, but climb downstairs and sot down and crouched and shivered over the stove just like the others. Well, Bill Bridges, he came tearing down like a wildcat, frightened half out of his wits, screeching, "Lord have mercy, we're all going to the devil," and then they all vanished. "Now, Captain, what's to be done?" says Tom. "If these here fellows is to take passage, we can't do nothing with the boys, that's clear." Well, so it turned out, for come next night there was 6 on 'em come in, and the story got round, and the boys was all on end. There weren't no doing nothing with 'em. You see, it's allers just so. Not but what dead folks is just as 'spectable as they was afore they's dead. These might have been as good fellers as any aboard, but it's human nature. The minute a feller's dead, why, you sorter don't know about him, and it's kind of scary having on him round, so 'twan't no wonder the boys didn't feel as if they could go on with the voyage if these here fellows was all to take passage. Come to look, too, there were considerable of a leak stove in the vessel, and the boys they all stood to it that if they went further they'd all go to the bottom. For, you see, once the story got a-going, every one on 'em saw a new thing every night. One on 'em saw the bait mill a-grinding, with no hands to grind it, and another saw fellers up aloft working in the sails. Well, the fact were, they just had to put about, run back to Castine. Well, the owners, they hushed up things as best they could, and they put the vessel on the stocks and worked her over, and put a new coat of paint on her, and called her the Betsy Ann, and she went a good voyage to the bank, and brought home the biggest fare of fish that had been for a long time, and she's made good voyages ever since, and that just proves what I've been a-saying, that there's nothing to drive out ghosts like fresh paint. End of section 12. Tom Toothaker's Ghost Story. Section 13 of Sam Lawson's Old Town Fireside Stories by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Section 13, The Parsons Racehorse. "Well, now, this year does beat all. I wouldn't have thought it of the deacon." So spoke Sam Lawson, drooping in a discouraged, contemplative attitude in front of an equally discouraged-looking horse that had just been brought to him by the widow Simpkins for medical treatment. Among Sam's many accomplishments, he was reckoned in the neighborhood an oracle in all matters of this kind, especially by women whose helplessness in meeting such emergencies found unfailing solace under his compassionate willingness to attend to any business that did not strictly belong to him, and from which no pecuniary return was to be expected. The widow Simpkins had bought this horse of Deacon Atkins, apparently a fairly well-appointed brute, and capable as he was good-looking. A short, easy drive, when the deacon held the reins, had shown off his points to advantage, and the widow's small stock of ready savings had come forth freely in payment for what she thought was a bargain. When, soon after coming into possession, she discovered that her horse, if driven with any haste, panted in a fearful manner, and that he appeared to be growing lame, she waxed wroth, and went to the deacon in anger, to be met only with the smooth reminder that the animal was all right when she took him, that she had seen him tried herself. The widow was of a nature somewhat spicy, and expressed herself warmly. "It's a cheat and a shame, and I'll take the law on you." "What law will you take?" said the unmoved deacon. "Wasn't it a fair bargain?" I'll take the law of God, said the widow with impotent indignation, and she departed to pour her cares and trials into the ever-ready ear of Sam. Having assumed the care of the animal, he now sat contemplating it in a sort of trance of melancholy reflection. "Why, boys," he broke out, "why didn't she come to me afore she bought this critter? Why, I knew all about him. That there critter was just ruined a year ago last summer, when Tom, the deacon's boy there, come home from college. Tom driv him over to Sherburne and back that there hot 4th of July. 'Member it, 'cause I saw the critter when he come home. I sot out with Tom taking care of him all night. That there critter had the thumps all night, and he ain't never been good for nothing since. I telled the deacon he was a gone hoss then, and wouldn't never be good for nothing. The deacon, he took off his shoes and let him run to pasture all summer, and he's been a-feedin' and nursing on him up, and now he's put him off on the widder. I wouldn't have thought it of the deacon. Why, this hoss'll never be no good to her. That there's a used-up critter any fool may see. He'll maybe do for about a quarter of an hour on a smooth road, but come to drive him as a body wants to drive, why, he blows like a bellicist, and the deacon knew it, must have known it." "Why, Sam," we exclaimed, "ain't the deacon a good man?" "Well, now, there's where the shoe pinches. In a general way, the deacon is a good man. He's considerable more than middlin' good. Generally, he adorns his profession. On most points, I don't have nothing agin the deacon, and this year ain't a bit like him. But there it is. Come to hosses, there's where the unsanctified nature comes out. Folks'll cheat about hosses when they won't about most nothing else." And Sam leaned back on his cold forge, now empty of coal, and seemed to deliver himself to a mournful train of general reflection. "Yes, hosses does seem to be sort of unregenerate critters," he broke out. "There's nothing about hosses that deceives the very elect. The best folks gets tripped up when they come to deal in hosses." "Why, Sam, is there anything bad in horses?" we interjected timidly. "'Tain't the horses, boys," said Sam with solemnity. "Lordy massy, the hosses is all right enough. Hosses is scriptural animals. Elijah went up to heaven in a chariot with horses, and then all them lots of horses in the Revelations, black and white and red, and all sorts of colors. That there shows hosses goes to heaven. But it's more'n the folks that have 'em is likely to, if they don't look out. Ministers, now," continued Sam in a soliloquizing vein, "folks allers thinks it's something sort of shaky in a minister to have much to do with hosses, sure to get 'em into trouble. There was old Parson Williams of North Bilricky got into a dreadful mess about a hoss. Lordy massy, he weren't to blame neither, but he got into the dreadfulest scrape you ever heard on. Come nigh to unsettling him." "Oh, Sam, tell us all about it," we boys shouted, delighted with the prospect of a story. "Well, wait now till I get off this critter's shoes, and we'll take him up to pasture, and then we can kind of sit by the river and fish. Hepsy wanted a mess of fish for supper, and I was calculating to get some for her. You boys go and be digging bait, and get your lines." And so, as we were sitting tranquilly beside the Charles River, watching our lines, Sam's narrative began. "You see, boys, Parson Williams, he's dead now, but when I was a boy he was one of the great men around here. He writ books. He writ a tract agin the Armenians and put 'em down, and he writ a big book on the millennium. I've got that there book now, and he was a smart preacher. Folks said he had invitations to settle in Boston, and there ain't no doubt he might have had a Boston parish if he'd have been a mind to take it. But he'd got a good settlement and a handsome farm in North Bilricky, and didn't care to move. Thought, I suppose, that 'twas better to be number one in a little place than number two in a big un. Anyway, he carried all before him where he was. Parson Williams was a tall, straight, personable man, come of a good family. Father and grand'ther before him all ministers. He was pretty up and down and commanding in his ways, and things had to go pretty much as he said. He was a good deal sot by, Parson Williams was, and his wife was a Derby, one of them rich Salem Derbys, and brought him a lot of money, and so they lived pretty easy and comfortable so far as this world's goods go. Well, now, the parson wasn't really what you call worldly minded, but then he was one of them folks that knows what's good in temporals as well as spirituals, and allers liked to have the best that there was going, and he allers had an eye to a good hoss. Now, there was Parson Adams and Parson Scranton, and most of the other ministers. They didn't know and didn't care what hoss they had. Just jogged around with these here pounding, pot-bellied, sleepy critters that ministers mostly has, good enough to crawl round to funerals and ministers' meetings and associations and such. But Parson Williams, he allers would have a hoss as was a hoss. He looked out for blood, and when these here Vermont fellers would come down with a drove, the parson he had his eyes open and knew what was what. Couldn't none of 'em cheat him on hoss flesh. And so one time, when Zach Buell was down with the drove, the doctor he bought the best hoss in the lot. Zach said he never see a parson afore that he couldn't cheat, but he said the doctor really knew as much as he did, and got the very one he'd meant to a keep for himself. Dish here hoss was a peeler, I tell you. They called him Tamerlane, from some heathen feller or other. The boys called him Tam for short. Tam was a great character. All the fellers for miles round knew the doctor's Tam, and used to come clear over from other parishes to see him. Well, this year sot up Cuff's back high, I'll tell you. Cuff was the doctor's nigger man, and he was naturally a dreadful proud critter. The way he would swell and strut and brag about the doctor and his folks and his things. The doctor used to give Cuff his cast-off clothes, and Cuff would prance around in 'em and seem to think he was a doctor of divinity himself and had the charge of all nature. Well, Cuff he really made an idol of that there hoss, a regular graven image, and bowed down and worshipped him. He didn't think nothing was too good for him. He washed and brushed and curried him, and rubbed him down till he shone like a lady's satin dress. And he took pride in riding and driving him, 'cause it was what the doctor wouldn't let nobody else do but himself. You see, Tam weren't no lady's hoss. Miss Williams was as afraid as death of him, and the parson he had to get her a sort of low-spirited critter that she could drive herself. But he liked to drive Tam, and he liked to go round the country on his back, and a fine figure of a man he was on him too. He didn't let nobody else back him or handle the reins but Cuff, and Cuff was dreadful set up about it, and he swelled and bragged about that there horse all round the country. Nobody couldn't put in a word about any other hoss without Cuff's feathers would be all up, stiff as a tom turkey's tail, and that's how Cuff got the doctor into trouble. You see, there naturally was others that thought they'd got horses and didn't want to be crowed over. There was Bill Atkins out to the West Parish, and Ike Sanders, that kept a stable up to Peekoo Holler. They was down a looking at the parson's hoss, and a betting on theirn, and a daring Cuff to race with him. Well, Cuff he couldn't stand it, and when the doctor's back was turned, he'd be off on the sly, and they'd have their race, and Tam he'd beat 'em all. Tam, you see, boys, was a hoss that couldn't and wouldn't have a hoss ahead of him. He just wouldn't. If he dropped down dead in his tracks the next minute, he would be ahead, and he allers got ahead. And so his name got up, and fellers kept coming to try their horses, and Cuff'd take Tam out to race with first one and then another, till this year got to be a regular thing, and begun to be talked about. Folks sort of wondered if the doctor knew, but Cuff was sly as a weasel, and allers had a story ready for every turn. Cuff was one of them fellers that could talk a bird off a bush, master hand he was to slick things over. There was folks that said they believed the doctor was knowing to it, and that he felt a sort of carnal pride such as a minister oughtn't fur to have, and so shut his eyes to what was going on. Aunt Sally Nickerson said she was sure on it. 'Twas all talked over down to old Miss Bumberger's funeral, and Aunt Sally, she said the church ought to look into it. But everybody knew Aunt Sally. She was allers watching for folks' haltings, and setting on herself up to judge her neighbors. Well, I never believed nothing against Parson Williams. It was all Cuff's contrivances. But the fact was, the fellers all got their blood up, and there was hoss racing in all the parishes, and it got so they'd even race hosses a Sunday. Well, of course, they never got the doctor's hoss out of Sunday. Cuff wouldn't have durst to do that. Lordy massy, no. He's allers there in church, setting up in the doctor's clothes, rolling up his eyes, and looking as pious as if he never thought of racing hosses. He was an awful solemn-looking nigger in church, Cuff was. But there was a lot of them fellers up to Peekoo Holler, Bill Atkins and Ike Sanders and Tom Peters and them hokum boys used to go out at a meeting Sunday afternoon and race hosses. You see, it was just close to the state line, and if the selectmen was to come down on 'em, they could just whip over the line, and they couldn't take 'em. Well, it got to be a great scandal. The fellers talked about it up to the tavern, and the deacons and the tithing man, they took it up and went to Parson Williams about it. And the parson, he told 'em just to keep still, not let the fellers know that they was being watched. And next Sunday he and the tithing man and the constable, they'd ride over and catch 'em in the very act. So next Sunday arternoon, Parson Williams and Deacon Popkins and Ben Bradley, he was constable that year, they got on their hosses and rode over to Peekoo Holler. The doctor's blood was up, and he meant to come down on 'em strong, for that was his way of doing in his parish, and they was in a sort of day of judgment frame of mind, and jogged along solemn as a hearse, till, come to rise the hill above the holler, they see 3 or 4 fellers with their hosses getting ready to race. And the parson says he, "Let's come on quiet and get behind these bushes, and we'll see what they're up to and catch 'em in the act." But the mischief on it was that Ike Sanders see 'em coming, and he knowed Tam in a minute. Ike knowed Tam of old, and he just tipped the wink to the rest. "Wait, boys," says he, "let 'em get close up, and then I'll give the word, and the doctor's hoss will be racing ahead like thunder." Well, so the doctor and his folks, they drew up behind the bushes and stood there innocent as could be, and saw 'em getting ready to start. Tam, he begun to snuffle and paw, but the doctor never mistrusted what he was up to till Ike sung out, "Go it, boys!" and the hosses all started, when sure as you live, boys, Tam give one fly and was over the bushes and in among 'em, going it like chain lightning ahead of 'em all. Deacon Popkins and Ben Bradley just stood and held their breath to see 'em all going it so like thunder, and the doctor, he was took so sudden it was all he could do to just hold on anyways, so away he went, and trees and bushes and fences streaked by him like ribbons. His hat flew off behind him, and his wig arter, and got ketched in a barberry bush, but lordy massy, he couldn't stop to think of them. He just leaned down and caught Tam around the neck and held on for dear life till they come to the stopping place. Well, Tam was ahead of 'em all, sure enough, and was snorting and snuffling as if he'd got the very old boy in him, and was up to racing some more on the spot. That there Ike Sanders was the impudentest feller that ever you see, and he roared and raw-hawed at the doctor. "Good for you, parson," says he. "You beat us all holler," says he. "Takes a parson for that, don't it, boys?" he said. And then he and Ike and Tom and the 2 hokum boys, they just roared and danced round like wild critters. Well, now, only thing on it, boys, what a situation that there was for the minister. A man that had come out with the best of motives to put a stop to Sabbath breaking, there he was all rumpled up and dusty, and his wig hanging in the bushes. And these here ungodly fellers getting the laugh on him, and all because of that there hoss. There's times, boys, when ministers must be tempted to swear if there ain't preventing grace, and this was one of them times to Parson Williams. They say he got red in the face and looked as if he should bust, but he didn't say nothing. He scorned to answer. The sons of Zeruiah was too hard for him, and he let 'em have their say. But when they'd got through, and Ben had brought him his hat and wig and brushed and settled him again, the parson he says, "Well, boys, you've had your say and your laugh, but I warn you now, I won't have this thing going on here any more," says he. "So mind yourselves." Well, the boys see that the doctor's blood was up, and they rode off pretty quiet, and I believe they never raced no more in that spot. But there ain't no telling the talk this year thing made. Folks will talk, you know, and there weren't a house in all Billericay, nor in the South Parish, nor Centre, where it weren't had over and discussed. There was the deacon, and Ben Bradley was there to witness and show just how the thing was, and that the doctor was just in the way of his duty, but folks said it made a great scandal, that a minister hadn't no business to have that kind of hoss, and that he'd give the enemy occasion to speak reproachfully. It really did seem as if Tam's sins was imputed to the doctor, and folks said he ought to sell Tam right away and get a sober minister's hoss. But others said it was Cuff that had got Tam into bad ways, and they do say that Cuff had to catch it pretty lively when the doctor come to settle with him. Cuff thought his time had come, sure enough, and was so scared that he turned blacker than ever. He got enough to cure him a hoss racing for one while. But Cuff got over it after a while, and so did the doctor. Lordy massy, there ain't nothing lasts forever. Wait long enough, and most everything blows over. So it turned out about the doctor. There was a rumpus and a fuss, and folks talked and advised. Everybody had their say, but the doctor kept right straight on, and kept his hoss all the same. The ministers, they took it up in the association, but come to tell the story, it sot 'em all a-laughing, so they couldn't be very hard on the doctor. The doctor felt sort of streaked at first when they told the story on him. He didn't just like it, but he got used to it, and finally, when he was twitted on it, he'd sort of smile and say, "Anyway, Tam beat 'em. That's one comfort." End of section 13. The Parsons Racehorse. Read by Michelle Fry, July 2015. Section 14 of Sam Lawson's Old Town Fireside Stories by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Section 14. Old Town Fireside Talks of the Revolution. The sacred work of preparation for Thanksgiving was at hand. Our kitchen was fragrant with the smell of cinnamon, cloves, and allspice, which we boys were daily set to pound in a great lignum vitae mortar. Daily the great oven flamed without cessation, and the splitting of oven wood kept us youngsters so busy that we scarce had a moment to play, yet we did it with a cheerful mind, inspired by the general aroma of coming festivity abroad in the house. Behold us this evening around the kitchen fire, with crackling and roaring up the wide chimney, brightening with its fluttering radiance the farthest corner of the ample room. A tub of rosy-cheeked apples, another of golden quinces, and a bushel basket filled with ruby cranberries stood in the midst of the circle. All hands were busy. Grandmother in one corner was superintending us boys as we peeled and quartered the fruit, an operation in which grandfather took a helping hand. Aunt Lois was busily looking over and sorting cranberries when a knock at the door announced a visitor. "Well, now, I suppose that's Sam Lawson, of course," snapped Aunt Lois. Aunt Lois generally spoke with a snap, but about Thanksgiving time it had a cheery ring, like the snapping of our brisk kitchen fire. "Good evening, Miss Badger and Miss Lois," said Sam. "I see your winders so bright, I couldn't help wanting to come in and help you pare apples or something." We boys made haste to give Sam the warmest welcome and warmest place in the chimney corner, and to accommodate him with a tin pan full of quinces and a knife when he was soon settled among us. "Well, this year does look cheerful. Looks like Thanksgiving," he began. Well, Lord a massy, we've got a great deal to be thankful for in this here land of privileges, hain't we, Deacon? I was a-comin' round by Miss Lothrop's to-day, and heard Dinah, she told me the doctor was getting a great sermon out on the 124th Psalm. If it had not been the Lord who was on our side when men rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us up. He is going to show all our deliverances in the war. I expect it'll be a whale of a sermon, 'cause when our minister sets out to do a thing, he most generally does it up to the handle. Tell you what, boys, you must listen with all your ears. You'll never know what times them was if you don't. You don't know what liberty cost us all. There's your grandfather now. He could tell you. He remembers when he went off to Lexington with his gun on his shoulders. Why, grandfather, did you go? We both exclaimed with wide eyes. Well, boys, said my grandfather, 'tain't worth talking about what I did. I was in my mill that day, minding my business, when Brother Con, he burst in and says he, 'Look here, Bill, the regulars are going up to Concord to destroy our stores, and we must all go. Come, get your gun.' Well, I said I was a miller, and millers were exempt from duty. But Con wouldn't let me alone. 'Get down your gun,' says he. 'Suppose we're going to let them British fellows walk over us?' says he. Well, Con always had his way of me, and I got my gun, and we started out through the woods over to Concord. We lived at Weston then, you see. Well, when we got on the brow of the hill, we looked over, and sure enough, there on Burying Ground Hill was the British regulars. The hill was all alive with them, marching here and there in their scarlet coats, like so many bees out of a hive. 'Con,' says I, 'just look there. What are you going to do?' 'Shoot some of 'em, I know,' says Con. And so we ran along, hiding behind trees and bushes and stone walls, till we got near enough to get a shot at 'em. You see, they broke up into companies, and went here and there about town, looking for the stores, and then as we got a chance, here and there, we marked our men, and popped, and then we'd run, and take aim somewhere else." "Well, now, that there warn't the hull on it," said Sam. "Why, there was hundreds of fellers doing just the same all round. It was just pop, pop, pop from every barn and every bush and clump of trees all along the way. Men was picked off all the time, and they couldn't see who did it, and it made 'em mad as fury. Why, I remember Miss Tom Bigelow, she that was Sary Jones, told me how they sot her mother's house afire and burned it down, 'cause their nigger man Caesar popped at 'em out of the buttery window. They didn't tell him to, but Caesar, he was full of fight like all the rest on 'em. Lordy massy, the niggers went for something in them times. Their blood was up as quick as anybody's. Why, there was old Pompey Lovejoy lived over by Pomp's Pond in Andover. He hitched up his wagon and driv over with 2 barrels of cider and some tin dippers, and was round all day giving drinks of cider to our men when they got hot and thirsty and tired. It was a pretty warm day for April, that was. Pomp has told me the story many a time. 'Twas all the cider he had, but cider goes for something as well as gunpowder in its place, and Pomp's cider come just right that day." "But, grandfather," said I, "what happened to you over there?" "Well, you see," said grandfather placidly, "I wasn't killed, but I come pretty nigh it. You see, they sent into Boston for reinforcements, and by the time we got to Lexington, Earl Percy was marching out with fresh troops and cannon. Con and I were standing on the meetin' house steps when there come a terrible bang, and something struck right over our heads and went into the meetin' house. 'Why, Bill,' says Con, 'what's that?' 'They've got cannon, that's what that is,' says I. 'Let's run around the other side.' So we did. But just as we got round there come another bang, and the ball crashed right through the meetin' house and come out of the pulpit window. Well, we saw there was no staying there, so we run then and got into a little clump of trees behind a stone wall, and there we saw 'em go by, Earl Percy on his horse and all his troops, ever so grand. He went on up to Concord. Fact is, if it hadn't been for him and his men, those regulars would all have been cut off. They wouldn't one of 'em have got back, for the whole country was up and fighting. The militia came pouring in from Weston and Acton and Billericay, all the towns around. Then their Colonel Smith was wounded, and a good many others, and lots of 'em killed, and our minute-men coming on 'em before and behind and all around. But you see, we couldn't stand regular troops and cannon, and so when they come on, we had to give back. Earl Percy came up and formed a hollow square, and they marched into it, and so gave 'em time to rest." "Well, there was need enough on it," said Sam. "The regulars had been hectored and picked and driv round so from pillar to post that they was dog tired. Jimmy Irwin, he was a little chap then, but he telled me how he see the men just threw 'emselves down on the ground, their tongues trailing out of their mouths like hunting dogs. You see, they had about 200 wounded, and 28 or 9 was taken prisoner, and 64 killed outright. So Lord Percy had his hands full to taking care of the mess they'd got up." "Yes," said my grandfather, "there were dead men lying all around the road as we came back. There, boys," he said, pointing to a gun and powder horn over the chimney, "we picked up these when we were coming home. We found them on a poor fellow who laid there dead in the road. There's some blood of his on it to this day. We couldn't help feeling it was most too bad, too." "Poor fellow, he ain't to blame," said my grandmother. "Soldiers have to go as they're bid. War is an awful thing." "Then they shouldn't have begun it," interposed Aunt Lois. "They that take the sword shall perish by the sword." "Well, Grandpa," said I, "what were the stores they went up to get?" "They were stores laid up to enable us to go to war, and they were round in different places. There were 2 24-pounders that they spiked, and they threw about 500 pounds of ball into the river or wells, and broke up 60 barrels of flour and scattered it about." "Well," said Sam triumphantly, "there was one lot they didn't get. Captain Tim Wheeler had about the biggest lot of wheat and rye flour and cornmeal stored up in his barn with some barrels of his own. So when this here fine jay-bird of an officer came to him all so grand and took him to open his barn and let him look in, the captain he took his key and walked right out and opened the barn door, and the officer was tickled to pieces. He thought he'd got such a haul. 'If you please, sir,' says the captain, 'I'm a miller, and I got my living by grinding grain. I'm a poor man. You can see my mill out there. I grind up a lot of grain in the winter and get it ready to sell in the spring. Some's wheat, and some's rye, and some's cornmeal. And this wheat is mine, and this rye is mine, and this cornmeal is mine.' And when he spoke, he put his hand on his own barrels. 'Oh, if this is your private property,' says the officer, 'we shan't touch that. We don't meddle with private property.' And so he turned on his heel, and the captain he locked up his barn." "Was that telling the truth?" said I. "Well, you see, it was true what he said," said Sam. "Them barrels he laid his hands on was his'n." "But Aunt Lois told me yesterday it was as bad to act a lie as to speak one," said I. "Well, so I did," said Aunt Lois. "The truth is the truth, and I'll stick to it." "But, Aunt Lois, would you have told him and let him break up all those barrels?" "No, I shouldn't," said Aunt Lois. "I should have done just as Captain Tim did, but I should have done wrong. Right is right, and wrong is wrong, even if I can't come up to it always." "What would you have done, Grandfather?" said I. My grandfather's mild face slowly irradiated, as when moonbeams pass over a rock. "Well, boys," he said, "I don't think I should have let him break up those barrels. If it was wrong to do as Captain Wheeler did, I think most likely I should have done it. I don't suppose I'm any better than he was." "Well, at any rate," said Aunt Lois, "what folks do in war time is no rule for ordinary times. Everything is upset then. There ain't any of the things they do in war time that are according to gospel teaching. But if you boys were to do just as Captain Wheeler did, I should say you lied by speaking the truth." "Well, well," said my grandmother, Those were dreadful times. Thank the Lord that they are past and gone, and we don't have such awful cases of conscience as we did then. I never could quite see how we did right to resist the king at all." "Why, the Bible says, 'Resist the devil,'" said Aunt Lois. A general laugh followed this sally. "I always heard," said my grandfather, by way of changing the subject, "that they meant to have taken Mr. Adams and Mr. Hancock and hung 'em." "Well, to be sure they did," said Sam Lawson. "I know all about that there. Sapphira Clark up to Lexington, she told me all about that there, one day when I was to her house putting down her best parlor carpet. Sapphira wasn't but 10 or 11 years old when the war broke out, but she remembered all about it. You see, Mr. Hancock and Mr. Adams was a-stayin' hid up at their house. Her father, Mr. Jonas Clark, was minister of Lexington, and he kept 'em quite private and didn't let nobody know they was there. Well, Sapphira said they was all a-settin' at supper, when her father he heard a great rapping at the front door, and her father got up and went and opened it, and she looked after him into the entry, and could just see a man in a scarlet uniform standing at the door, and she heard him ask, 'Are Sam Adams and John Hancock here?' And her father answered, 'Oh, hush, don't mention those names here.' 'Then,' says the man, 'I come to tell you the British troops will be along by sunrise, and if they are in your house they'd better escape right away.'" "That must have been Colonel Paul Revere," said Aunt Lois. "He went all through the country, from Boston to Concord, rousing up people and telling 'em to be ready. Well, what did Mr. Adams and Hancock do?" "Well, they got ready right away, and slipped quietly out the back door, and made their way over to Burlington, and stayed in the minister's house over there, out of the way of the battle." "What would the British have done with them if they had caught them?" said I. "Hung 'em high as Haman," said my Aunt Lois sententiously. "That's what they'd have done to him, and to General Washington, and lots more, if they'd had their way." "Oh, yes," said Grandfather. "They were mighty high-stepping at first. They thought they had only to come over and show themselves, and they could walk through the land, and hang and burn and slay just whom they'd a mind to." "Well, they found 'twas like jumping into a hornet's nest," said Sam Lawson. "They found that out at Lexington and Bunker Hill." "Brother Con was in those trenches at Bunker Hill," said Grandfather. "There they dug away at the breastworks with the bomb shells firing round 'em. They didn't mind them more than if they'd been hickory nuts. They kept fellows ready to pour water on 'em as they fell." "Well, I never want to feel again as I did that day," said Grandmother. "I was in Boston, visiting Cousin Jemima Russell, and we were all out on the roof of the house. The roofs everywhere were all alive, with people looking through spy-glasses, and we could hear the firing, but couldn't tell how the day was going. And then they set Charleston on fire, and the blaze and smoke and flame rose up, and there was such a snapping and crackling. And we could hear roofs and timbers falling, and see people running this way and that with their children, women scared half to death of flying, and we knew all the time there was Cousin Jane Wilkinson in that town, sick in bed, with a baby only a few days old. It's a wonder how Jane ever lived through it, but they did get her through alive, and her baby too. That burning Charleston settled the point with a good many. They determined then to fight it through, it was so mean and cruel and needless." "Yes," said my grandfather, "that day settled the question that we would be free and independent or die, and though our men had to retreat, yet it was as good as a defeat to the British. They lost 154 in killed and wounded, and we only 453, and our men learned that they could fight as well as the British. Congress went right to work to raise an army and appointed General Washington commander. Your Granther Stowe, boys, was orderly of the day when General Washington took the command at Cambridge." "Well," said Sam, "I was in Cambridge that day and saw it all. You see, the army was drawn up under the big elm there, and Ike Newell and we clim up into a tree and got a place where we could look down and see. I wasn't but 10 year old then, but if ever a mortal man looked like the angel of the Lord, the general looked like it that day." Some said there was trouble about having General Ward give up the command to a Southern gentleman, said my grandfather. General Ward was a brave man and very popular, but everybody was satisfied when they came to know General Washington. "There couldn't no minister have seemed more godly than he did that day," said Sam. "He read out of the hymn book the 101st Psalm." "What is that psalm?" said I. "Laws, boy, I know it by heart," said Sam. "I was so impressed hearing on him read it, I could say it to you. Mercy and judgment are my song, and since they both to thee belong, my gracious God, my righteous King, to thee my songs and vows I bring. If I am raised to bear the sword, I'll take my counsels from thy word. Thy justice and thy heavenly grace shall be the pattern of my ways. I'll search the land and raise the just to posts of honor, wealth, and trust. The men who work thy righteous will shall be my friends and favorites still. The impious crew, the factious band, shall hold their peace or quit the land, and all who break the public rest, where I have power, shall be suppressed." "And he did it, too," remarked Aunt Lois. "He trusted in the Lord, and the Lord brought him honor," said my grandmother. "When he took the army, everything was against us. It didn't seem possible we should succeed." "Well, he was awful put to it sometimes," said Sam Lawson. "I remember Uncle David Morris was a-telling me about that there time down in New York when the Massachusetts and Connecticut boys all broke and run." "Massachusetts boys run? How came that, Sam?" said I. "Well, you see, sometimes fellers will get a running, and it just goes from one to another like fire, and you can't stop it. It was after the Battle of Long Island, when our men had been fighting day after day and had to retreat. A good many were wounded, and a good many of them were sick and half sick, and they got sort of tired and discouraged. Well, Lord Howe and the British came to make a landing at Kip's Bay round by New York, and the troops set to guard the landing began to run, and the Massachusetts and Connecticut men were sent to help them. Uncle David says that the fellers that run spread the panic among 'em, and they looked ahead and saw an ox drag on top of a hill they was to pass, and they thought 'twas a cannon pointing right at 'em, and the boys, they just broke and run, cut right across the road and cleared over the fence and streaked it off cross lots and uphill like a flock of sheep. Uncle David, he run too, but he'd been sick of dysentery and was so weak he couldn't climb the fence, so he stopped and looked back and saw General Washington cantering up behind him, shouting and waving his sword, looking like a flaming fire. Oh, he was thundering mad, the general was, and when he see the fellows skirting off cross lots, he just slammed his hat down on the ground and give up. 'Great heavens,' says he, 'are these the men I've got to fight this battle with?' Well, Uncle David, he picked up the general's hat and come up and made his bow and said, 'General, here's your hat.' 'Thank you, sir,' said the general. 'I'm glad to see one brave feller that can stand his ground. You didn't run.' Uncle David said he felt pretty cheap, 'cause he knowed in his own heart that he would have run, only he was too weak to get over the fence. But he didn't tell the general that, I bet. He put the compliment in his pocket and said nothing, for now the general's aides came riding up full drive and told him they must be off out of this field in a minute or the British would have 'em, and so one on 'em took Uncle David up behind him and away they cantered. It was a pretty close shave, too. The British was only a few rods behind 'em. 'Oh dear, if they had caught him,' said I. 'Only think!' 'Well, they would have hung him, but we should have had another in his place,' said Aunt Lois. 'The war wouldn't have stopped.' 'Well, 'twas to be as 'twas,' said my grandmother. 'The Lord had respect to the prayers of our fathers, and he decreed that America should be free.'" "Yep," said Sam. Parson Badger said in one of his sermons that men always was safe when they was going in the line of God's decrees. I guess that thar was about it. But, massy, is that there the 9 o'clock bell? I must make haste home, or I don't know what Hetty'll say to me. End of section 14, Old Town Fireside Talks of the Revolution. Read by Michelle Fry, July 2015. Section 15 of Sam Lawson's Old Town Fireside Stories by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Section 15. A Student's Sea Story. Among the pleasantest of my recollections of old Bodwin is the salt air flavor of its sea experiences. The site of Brunswick is a sandy plain, on which the college buildings seem to have been dropped for the good old Yankee economic reason of using land for public buildings that could not be used for anything else. The soil was a fathomless depth of dry, sharp, barren sand, out of whose bosom nothing but pitch pines and blueberry bushes emerged, or ever could emerge without superhuman effort of cultivation. But these sandy plains, these pine forests, were neighbors to the great, lively, musical blue ocean, whose life-giving presence made itself seen, heard, and felt every hour of the day and night. The beautiful peculiarity of the Maine coast, where the sea interpenetrates the land in picturesque fjords and lakes, brought a constant romantic element into the landscape. White-winged ships from India or China came gliding into the lonely solitude of forest recesses, bringing news from strange lands and tidings of wild adventure into secluded farmhouses that, for the most part, seemed to be dreaming in woodland solitude. In the early days of my college life, the shipping interest of Maine gave it an outlook into all the countries of the earth. Ships and shipbuilding and ship launching were the drift of the popular thought, and the very minds of the people by this commerce had apparently "suffered the sea change into something rare and strange." There was a quaintness, shrewdness, and vivacity about these men, half skipper or half farmer, that was piquant and enlivening. It was in the auspicious period of approaching Thanksgiving that my chum and I resolved to antedate for a few days our vacation, and take passage on the little sloop Brilliant that lay curtsying and teetering on the bright waters of Maquot Bay, loading up to make her Thanksgiving trip to Boston. It was a bright Indian summer afternoon that saw us all on board the little craft. She was laden deep with dainties and rarities for the festal appetites of Boston nabobs, loads of those mealy potatoes for which the fields of Maine were justly famed, barrels of ruby cranberries, boxes of solid golden butter, ventures of a thrifty house mother emulous to gather kindred gold in the Boston market. Then there were dressed chickens, turkeys, and geese, all going the same way, on the same errand, and there were sides and saddles of that choice mutton for which the sea islands of Maine were as famous as the South Downs of England. Everything in such a stowage was suggestive of good cheer. The little craft itself had a sociable, friendly, domestic air. The captain and mate were cousins. The men were all neighbors, sons of families who had grown up together. There was a kindly home flavor in the very stowage of the cargo. Here were Melissa's cranberries, and by many a joke and wink we were apprised that the mate had a tender interest in that venture. There was Widow Toothaker's butter, concerning which there were various comments and speculations, but which was handled and cared for with the consideration the Maine sailor boy always gives to the widder. There was a private keg of very choice eggs, over which the name of Lucindy Ann was breathed by a bright-eyed, lively youngster, who had promised to bring her back the change, and as to the precise particulars of this change, many a witticism was expended. Our mode of living on the Brilliant was of the simplest and most primitive kind. On each side, the staircase that led down to the cabin, hooped strongly to the partition, was a barrel, which on one side contained salt beef, and on the other salt pork. A piece out of each barrel, delivered regularly to the cook, formed the foundation of our daily meals, and sea biscuit and potatoes, with the sauce of saltwater appetites, made this a feast for a king. I make no mention here of gingerbread and doughnuts and such like ornamental accessories, which were not wanting, nor of nuts and sweet cider, which were to be had for the asking. At meal times a swing shelf, which at other seasons hung flat against the wall, was propped up, and our meals were eaten thereon in joyous satisfaction. A joyous, rollicking set we were, and the whole expedition was a frolic of the first water. One of the drollest features of these little impromptu voyages often was the woebegone aspect of some unsuspecting landlubber who had been beguiled into thinking that he would like a trip to Boston by seeing the pretty Brilliant curtsying in the smooth waters of Maquot, and so had embarked in innocent ignorance of the physiological results of such enterprises. I remember the first morning out. As we were driving ahead, under a stiff breeze, I came on the deck and found the respectable Deacon Muggins, who in his Sunday coat had serenely embarked the day before, now desolately clinging to the railing, very white about the gills, and contemplating the sea with the most suggestive expression of disgust and horror. "Why, Deacon, good morning. How are you?" "Splendid morning," said I maliciously. He drew a deep breath, surveyed me with a mixture of indignation and despair, and then gave vent to his feelings. "Tell you what, there was one darned old fool up to Brunswick yesterday, but he ain't there now. He's here." The deacon, in the weekly prayer meeting at Brunswick, used to talk of the necessity of being, "emptied of self." He seemed to be in the way of it in the most literal manner at the present moment. In a few minutes he was extended on the deck, the most utterly limp and dejected of deacons, and vowing with energy if he ever got out of this here you wouldn't catch him again. Of course my chum and I were not seasick. We were prosperous young sophomores at Bodwin College, and would have scorned to acknowledge such a weakness. In fact, we were in that happy state of self-opinion where we surveyed everything in creation, as birds do, from above, and were disposed to patronize everybody we met with a pleasing conviction that there was nothing worth knowing but what we were likely to know, or worth doing but what we could do. Captain Stanwood liked us, and we liked him. We patronized him, and he was quietly amused at our patronage, and returned it in kind. He was a good specimen of the sea captain in those early days in Maine, a man in middle life, tall, thin, wiry, and active, full of resource and shrewd mother-wit, a man very confident in his opinions, because his knowledge was all got at first hand, the result of a careful use of his own 5 senses. From his childhood he had followed the seas, and as he grew older made voyages to Archangel, to Messina, to the West Indies, and finally round the Horn, and having carried a very sharp and careful pair of eyes, he had acquired not only a snug competency of worldly goods, but a large stock of facts and inductions, which stood him in the stead of an education. He was master of a thriving farm at Harpswell, and being tethered somewhat by love of wife and children, was mostly stationary there, yet solaced himself by running a little schooner to Boston, and driving a thriving bit of trade by the means. With that reverence for learning which never deserts the New Englander, he liked us the better for being collegians, and amiably conceded that there were things quite worth knowing taught up to Brunswick there, though he delighted now and then to show his superiority in talking about what he knew better than we. Jim Larned, the mate, was a lusty youngster, a sister's son whom he had taken in training in the way he should go. Jim had already made a voyage to Liverpool and the East Indies, and felt himself also quite an authority in his own way. The evenings were raw and cool, and we generally gathered round the cabin stove, cracking walnuts, smoking, and telling stories, and having a jolly time generally. It is but due to those old days to say that a most respectable Puritan flavor penetrated even the recesses of those coasters, a sort of gentle Bible and psalm book aroma, so that there was not a word or a joke among the men to annoy the susceptibilities even of a deacon. Our deacon, somewhat consoled and amended, lay serene in his berth, rather enjoying the yarns that we were spinning. The web, of course, was many-colored, of quaint and strange and wonderful, and as the night wore on, it was dyed in certain weird tints of the supernatural. "Well," said Jim Larned, "folks may say what they're a mind to. There are things that there's no sort of way accounting for, things you've just got to say. Well, here's something to work that I don't know nothing about, and come to question any man up sharp, you'll find he's seen one thing of that sort himself, and this year I'm going to tell's my story. 4 years ago I went down to Aunt Jerushy's at Fairhaven. Her husband's in the oystering business, and I used to go out with him considerable. Well, there was Bill Jones there, a real bright feller, one of your open-handed, lively fellows, and he took a fancy to me, and I to him, and he and I struck up a friendship. He run an oyster smack to New York, and did a considerable good business for a young man. Well, Bill had a fellow on his smack that I never liked the looks of. He was from the Michaelides, or some foreign critter or other, spoke broken English, had eyes set kind of edgeways in his head, homely as sin he was, and I always mistrusted him. Bill, I used to say, you look out for that feller. Don't you trust him. If I was you, I'd ship him off short meter. But Bill, he only laughed. Why, says he, I can get double work for the same pay out of that feller, and what do I care if he ain't handsome? I remember how chipper and cheery Bill looked when he was saying that, just as he was going down to New York with his load of oysters. Well, the next night I was sound asleep in Aunt Jerushy's front chamber that opens toward the Sound, and I was waked right clear up out of sleep by Bill's voice screaming to me. I got up and run to the window and looked out, and I heard it again, plain as anything. "Jim, Jim, help, help!" It wasn't a common cry, neither. It was screeched out as if somebody was murdering him. I tell you, it rung through my head for weeks afterwards. "Well, what came of it?" said my chum, as the narrator made a pause, and we all looked at him in silence. "Well, as nigh as I can make it out, that very night poor Bill was murdered by that very Malay feller, leastways his body was found in his boat. He'd been stabbed, and all his money and watch and things taken, and this Malay was gone nobody knew where. That's all that was ever known about it." "But surely," said my chum, who was of a very literal and rationalistic turn of mind, "it couldn't have been his voice you heard. He must have been down to the other end of the Sound, close by New York by that time." "Well," said the mate, "all I know is that I was waked out of sleep by Bill's voice calling my name, screaming in a real agony. It went through me like lightning, and then I found he was murdered that night. Now, I don't know anything about it. I know I heard him calling me. I know he was murdered, but how it was, or what it was, or why it was, I don't know." "These yer college boys can tell you," said the captain. "Of course they've got into sophomore year, and there ain't nothing in heaven or earth that they don't know." "No," said I say with Hamlet, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in your philosophy." "Well," said my chum with the air of a philosopher, "what shakes my faith in all supernatural stories is that I can't see any use or purpose in them." "Well, if there couldn't nothing happen nor be except what you could see a use in, there wouldn't much happen nor be," quoth the captain. A laugh went round at the expense of my friend. "Well, now, I'll tell you what, boys," piped the thin voice of the deacon. "Folks mustn't be too presumptuous. There is providences permitted that we don't see no use in, but they do happen. Yes, they do. Now, what Jim Larned's been a-telling is a good deal like what happened to me once, when I was up to Umbagog in the lumbering business." "Halloo!" called out Jim. "Here's the deacon's story. I told you every man had one. Give it to us, deacon. Speak out, and don't be bashful." "Well, really it ain't what I like to talk about," said the deacon in a quavering, uncertain voice, "but I don't know but I may as well, though. It was that winter I was up to Umbagog. I was a clerk, and kept the accounts and the books and all that. And Tom Hully, he was surveyor and marker. He was there with me, and we chummed together. And there was Jack Cutter. He was just out of college. He was there practicing surveying with me. We three had a kind of pine board sort of shanty built out on a plain near by the camp. It had a fireplace and 2 windows and our bunks, and each of us had our tables and books and things. Well, Hully, he started with a party of 3 or 4 to go up through the woods to look out a new tract. He was 2 or 3 days' journey through the woods, and just about that time the Indians was up there getting sort of uneasy, and we all thought maybe 'twas sort of risky. Howsomedever, Tom had gone off in high spirits and told us to be sure and take care of his books and papers. Tom had a lot of books and thought everything of 'em, and was sort of particular and nice about his papers. His table set up one side by the window where he could see to read and write. Well, he'd been gone 4 days when one night, it was a bright moonlight night, Jack and I were sitting by the fire reading, and between 9 and 10 o'clock there came a strong, regular knock on the window over by Tom's table. We were sitting with our backs to the window. "Halloo," says Jack, "who's that?" We both jumped up and went to the window and looked out, and see there weren't nobody there. "This is curious," said I. "Some of the boys trying to trick us," says he. "Let's keep watch. Perhaps they'll do it again," says he. We sat down by the fire, and 'fore long it came again. Then Jack and I both cut out the door and run round the house, he one way and I the other. It was light as day, and nothing for anybody to hide behind, and there weren't a critter in sight. Well, we come in and sat down and looked at each other kind of puzzled, when it come again, harder than ever, and Jack looked to the window and got as white as a sheet. "For the Lord's sake, do look," says he, "and you may believe me or not, but I tell you it's a solemn fact. Tom's books was moving just as if somebody was picking 'em up and putting 'em down again, just as I've seen him do 100 times. "Jack," says I, "something's happened to Tom." Well, there had. That very night Tom was murdered by the Indians. We put down the date, and a week after the news came. "Come now, Captain," said I, breaking the pause that followed the deacon's story, "give us your story. You've been all over the world, in all times and all weathers, and you ain't a man to be taken in. Did you ever see anything of this sort?" "Well, now, boys, since you put it straight at me, I don't care if I say I have. On these here very waters we're sailing over now, on board this very schooner, in this very cabin." This was bringing matters close home. We felt an agreeable shiver and looked over our shoulders. The deacon in his berth raised up on his elbow and ejaculated, "Do tell! You don't say so!" "Tell us about it, Captain," we both insisted. "We'll take your word for most anything." "Well, it happened about 5 years ago. It's going on 8 years ago that my father died. He sailed out of Gloucester, had his home there, and after he died, Mother, she just kept on in the old place. I went down at first to see her fixed up about right, and after that I went now and then I sent money. Well, it was about Thanksgiving time, as it is now, and I'd been down to Boston, and was coming back pretty well loaded with the things I'd been buying in Boston for Thanksgiving at home. Raisins and sugar and all sorts of West Indy goods from the folks in Harpswell. Well, I meant to have gone down to Gloucester to see Mother, but I had so many ways to run and so much to do, I was afraid I wouldn't be back on time, and so I didn't see her. Well, we was driving back with a good stiff breeze, and we'd got past Cape Ann, and I'd gone down and turned in, and was fast asleep in my berth. It was past midnight, every one on the schooner asleep except the mate, who was up on the watch. I was sleeping as sound as ever I slept in my life, not a dream nor a feeling, no more'n if I had been dead, when suddenly I waked square up. My eyes flew open like a spring, with my mind clear and wide awake, and sure as ever I see anything, I see my father standing right in the middle of the cabin, looking right at me. I rose right up in my berth, and says I, 'Father, is that you?' "Yes," says he, "it is me." "Father," says I, "what do you come for?" "Sam," says he, "do you go right back to Gloucester and take your mother home with you and keep her there as long as she lives." And says I, "Father, I will." And as I said this, he faded out and was gone. I got right up and run up on deck and called out, "'Bout ship!" Mr. Moore, he was my mate then, stared at me as if he didn't believe his ears. "'Bout ship," says I. "I'm going to Gloucester." Well, he put the ship about, and then came to me and says, "What the devil does this mean? We're way past Cape Ann. It's 40 miles right back to Gloucester." "Can't help it," I said. "To Gloucester I must go as quick as wind and water will carry me. I've thought of matters there that I must attend to, no matter what happens." Well, Ben Moore and I were good friends always, but I tell you, all that day he watched me in a curious kind of way to see if I weren't took with a fever or something. And the men, they whispered and talked among themselves. You see, they all had their own reasons for wanting to be back to Thanksgiving, and it was hard on them. Well, it was just about sun-up, and we got into Gloucester, and I went ashore, and there was Mother, looking pretty poorly, just making her fire and getting on her kettle. When she saw me, she held up her hands and burst out crying. "Why, Sam, the Lord must have sent you. I've been sick and all alone, having a dreadful hard time, and I felt as if I couldn't hold out much longer." "Well," says I, "Mother, pack up your things and come right aboard the sloop, for I've come to take you home and take care of you, so put up your things." Well, I took hold and helped her, and we put things together lively, and packed up her trunks, and tied up the bed and pillows and bedclothes, and took her rocking chair and bureau and tables and chairs down to the sloop. And when I came down, bringing her and all her things, Ben Moore seemed to see what I was after, but how or why the idea came into my head I never told him. There's things that a man feels shy of telling, and I didn't want to talk about it. Well, when we was all aboard, the wind sprung up fair and steady, and we went on at a right spanking pace, and the fellows said the Harpswell girls had got hold of our rope and was pulling us with all their might, and we came in all right the very day before Thanksgiving. And my wife was as glad to see Mother as if she'd expected her, and fixed up the front chamber for her with a stove in it and plenty of kindlings. And the children was all so glad to see Grandma, and we had the best kind of a Thanksgiving. "Well," said I, "nobody could say there wasn't any use in that spirit's coming, if spirit it was. It had a most practical purpose." "Well," said the captain, "I've been all round the world, in all sorts of countries, seen all sorts of queer, strange things, and seen so many things that I never could have believed if I hadn't seen 'em, that I never say I won't believe this or that. If I see a thing right straight under my eyes, I don't say it couldn't have been there, 'cause college folks say there ain't no such things." "How do you know it wasn't all a dream?" said my chum. "How do I know? 'Cause I was broad awake, and I generally know when I'm awake and when I'm asleep. I think Mr. Moore found me pretty wide awake." It was now time to turn in, and we slept soundly while the Brilliant plowed her way. By daybreak the dome of the State House was in sight. "I've settled the captain's story," said my chum to me. "It can all be accounted for on the theory of cerebral hallucination." "All right," said I, "but it answered the purpose beautifully for the old mother." End of section 15. End of Sam Lawson's Old Town Fireside Stories, read by Michelle Fry, July 2015. Thanks for listening.